So today we are going to talk about a design pattern which is called MVC, Model View Controller. So let's understand why do we need a design pattern. First of all, what is design pattern? So design pattern are basically such a patterns. You can say patterns means it's such a way of organizing things that will make your life easier while you are building a big application. So it helps the developer to organize the code for a big and complex application in much simpler, repeatable forms. So that's why design patterns have become popular, and model view controller is one of the most popular design pattern seen throughout this evolution of microservices development. The reason is it provides such loose coupling between different components, so it can be easily scaled and complex functionalities can be easily achieved using the same structure. So let's try to understand what exactly is model view controller MVC design pattern. For that, let's understand how a request comes from the user first. So if you see, this is the user makes a request and then it has to go somewhere on the server, and then some operation should happen, maybe fetching data from the database and then passing that data back to the controller, and then the controller asking for the page on which this data to be shown, and then bundling this data together and sending it back to the controller, and then the response is sent back to the user. So in a nutshell, this is how it works. But let's understand now in very detailed way. The reason of separating the model view and controller in separate boxes is that each of them has their own responsibility that they have to uh, get through. So we'll look at what is the responsibility of model, what is the responsibility of view, and what is the responsibility of controller. And when does this responsibility comes into picture? While processing the request which is coming from the user. So every block here has a specific functionality. So let's try to understand each of the blocks responsibility here. So let's say first there will be a request from the user to the server, and the server will basically first check the URL, and based on URL, so let's say this is number one when the request is being made. Now this request will be having certain URL, and based on that URL, server is going to send that request to a specific controller on the server, because on the server there are many controllers running. Now as the specific controller which matches this URL receives the request, then this controller is going to tell the rest of the application what what needs to happen, and that's why its name is controller. It controls the processing of the request. So let's write down the first functionality of this is handles request flow. And then as this is meant for handling the request flow and then interacting with the model and the view, so this controller should not have lot of logic. Otherwise, we are defying the purpose of the model view controller design pattern. The job of the controller is just to handle the request coming from the user. So based on the URL, the request gets mapped to a particular controller. And then its next job is to navigate or do the controlling part with the model and the view for that particular request. So we should not have a lot of business logic in the controller layer. Let's let's look at what happens next. So after the controller receives the request, it sends this request to the model to get the data for it. Basically, model is responsible for doing everything that's needed to process the data for this particular request. So let's put it here as point number 2, get data. Now that the model receives the request, its job is to basically first handle the data logic, like it talks to the database, does all kinds of SQL queries, saves the data, does all the validations that's needed, those kind of things it does. When I say data logic, it does the validation and then does the querying on the database, fetches the data, populates the Java model or the model object. The second thing that it does is, of course, interacts with the database. So these are the two things that the model does as soon as it gets the request from the controller. So now it simply means that the controller doesn't have to worry about any data logic or interaction with the database. It just sends the request to the model, and then the model knows what data logic and how it has to interact with the database to process that request and fetch that data and return that to the controller. So they are independent. They don't interfere in between their jobs. So what happens next? Then the model sends the data to the controller. The data which was requested is returned here. Then the controller knows how to handle all the uh, error handling and what kind of next page or the view or the navigation that has to be shown. The controller will do it next. So here, let's write down a point. Controller never handles data logic. Controller is not responsible for handling the data logic. So next is, once the controller receives the data from the model, it is going to send a request to the view. So now the request is sent to the view. The controller asks for the specific view for this particular request. So let's mention here, get presentation. And now what is the responsibility of the view or the presentation? Its job is to just handle how to show the data, how to show the data which is returned from the model to the controller. So this data, let's put that in words, handles data presentation. So view is just a dynamic, let's say HTML, which is getting the data, and its job is to just show it in a nice way. So dynamically renders the data, dynamically rendered, which means, let's say if the data changed here, so model is going to give a new data to this view. This view is going to show the new data next time. So the job of the view is just to handle how to show the data and render it dynamically. So once the view has presented the data, it is going to send the response or the final representation of the view back to the controller. Let's put it this way. And now the view knows, the controller knows to return this particular view, which already has the data rendered to the requester. So we have the response here. Let's put it here. Yeah, the response. So now the user gets the response. One of the important point to keep in mind is in this design pattern is that the model and the view never talk to each other directly. If you see, there is no link between the model and view. Everything happens via the controller. So this is a very key concept of this model view controller design pattern. We have to keep this in mind. The biggest advantage of having no interaction between the model and the view is that you don't worry about how to fetch the data. The view doesn't have to worry about the how to fetch the data. Similarly, the model doesn't have to worry about how to show the data. So the controller is the middleman who is acting and doing the coordination between the model and the view, which means now you can build a very complex application in using the same format and the same pattern, and then the application can keep on growing. Even doesn't matter, the complexity increases by 10 folds. So that's the advantage of following model view controller design pattern. Okay, let's take an example of a user requesting a list of products, all the products. He wants to see all the products. So the request is like slash products. Now on the server, the controller which is responsible for handling the products is being invoked. So that particular controller, product controller gets invoked, and that product controller calls the model and asks for the data for the products. The model then queries the database. Let's say select star from a product table, and the model returns the list of products here. And if the controller receives a successful list of products here, the controller is going to ask the view to give a view which is responsible for showing this products, all the products. Now the view is going to embed all the products inside it and is going to return the view with embedded products data. Then the controller is going to respond back to the user with the HTML page and the CSS style in it with the products data. But let's say while fetching the products from the database, the model does not get the products and it returns error. Then the controller is going to ask the view again, but this time it will ask for error presentation, error page, where it will show that something went wrong while fetching the products. And that presentation will be returned to the controller. And then the controller is going to return that to the user, that there was an error accessing the products. So this is how controller is doing all the controlling mechanism. So if you see, the model handles all the data part, the view handles how to show the data, and the controller tells the model what needs to be done, and the controller tells the view what needs to be done. And the controller interacts with the user, and how does the control specific controller gets invoked based on the request URL, because there are many controllers here, many models, many views. So each controller gets invoked with this on a specific URL, and that controller knows which model to invoke and which view to invoke. So this is how the model view controller architecture works, or the design pattern works.